Welcome to the final episode of our World War II series. I'm your host, and today we explore the legacy of World War II, how the war's end became not a conclusion, but a beginning that continues to shape our world 8 decades later. When the guns fell silent in 1945, humanity faced a shattered planet. 50 million dead, entire continents in ruins, and weapons capable of ending civilization itself. The victorious Allies had won the war, but could they win the peace? The answer would determine whether the sacrifices of World War II would lead to a better world or merely set the stage for an even more devastating conflict. From the rubble of Berlin to the founding of the United Nations, from the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe to the decolonization that reshaped Africa and Asia, from the Cold War's frozen tensions to today's struggles with authoritarianism and genocide, World War II's legacy surrounds us still. This is the story of how a war that ended in 1945 continues to influence every aspect of our modern world, and why understanding that legacy remains essential for anyone seeking to comprehend the challenges we face today. A divided world. The Cold War begins. The Grand Alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany began fracturing even before the war's end. The marriage of convenience between democratic capitalists and communist authoritarians had been held together by a common enemy. With Hitler dead and fascism defeated, the fundamental contradictions between East and West quickly emerged. The division of Europe began at the wartime conferences, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin negotiated the post-war order. What seemed like pragmatic arrangements for occupying defeated territories soon hardened into permanent spheres of influence that would divide the continent for nearly half a century. Winston Churchill, voted out of office despite leading Britain to victory, delivered a speech at Westminster College in Missouri on March 5, 1946, that defined the emerging reality. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The metaphor was perfect. Europe was literally being divided by barriers of concrete, barbed wire, and armed guards. The transformation was swift and brutal. In Poland, the Home Army fighters who had battled the Nazis found themselves imprisoned by their Soviet liberators. Czechoslovakia's democratic government was overthrown in a communist coup in 1948. Hungary's multi-party system was dismantled piece by piece. The Baltic states simply disappeared, absorbed into the Soviet Union as if their independence had never existed. Stalin's paranoia, combined with his determination to create a buffer zone of satellite states, created exactly the threat that Western leaders had feared. The Soviet Union, having lost over 20 million people in the war, was determined never again to face invasion from the West. But their security required the enslavement of Eastern Europe, creating an intolerable situation for the Western democracies. The United Nations, founded in San Francisco in June 1945, was meant to prevent future wars through collective security and international cooperation. The organization embodied humanity's hopes for a world where disputes would be settled through diplomacy rather than force. But the UN was crippled from birth by the veto power given to the 5 permanent Security Council members, any one of whom could paralyze the organization. The first major test came in Greece, where communist guerrillas threatened to overthrow the monarchy. Britain, exhausted by 6 years of war, could no longer maintain its global commitments. President Harry Truman faced a choice: allow Greece to fall to communism or accept America's new role as leader of the free world. The Truman Doctrine, announced on March 12, 1947, committed the United States to supporting free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. It was a revolutionary departure from American isolationism and the beginning of containment, the policy that would guide U.S. strategy for the next 4 decades. The Berlin blockade of 1948 to 49 brought the world to the brink of another war just 3 years after the last one ended. Stalin's attempt to force the Western powers out of Berlin by cutting off all land access to the city was met by an unprecedented airlift that kept 2 million Berliners alive for 11 months. The crisis ended when Stalin backed down, but Berlin remained divided, a symbol of the broader Cold War that now gripped the world. NATO's formation in 1949 formalized the Western Alliance, binding America to Europe's defense through Article 5's promise that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. The Soviet response came in 1955 with the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance that turned Eastern Europe into a vast armed camp under Moscow's control. The division of Germany became the Cold War's most visible symbol. The nation that had started World War II was split between East and West, with families separated, cities divided, and an entire people transformed into pawns in the superpower struggle. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, would stand for 28 years as the Cold War's most potent symbol, concrete proof that the peace won in 1945 was incomplete and fragile. Nuclear weapons transformed the nature of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's successful atomic test in 1949 ended America's nuclear monopoly and began an arms race that would consume trillions of dollars and threaten human survival. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, created a paradox: peace maintained through the threat of total annihilation. The Cold War that emerged from World War II's ashes would dominate international relations for nearly half a century, spawning proxy conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan. The war that was supposed to end all wars had instead created the conditions for a different kind of conflict, one that brought humanity repeatedly to the brink of nuclear destruction. Rebuilding the world, Marshall Plan, and decolonization. While the Cold War divided Europe, the massive task of reconstruction began. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Entire cities reduced to rubble, transportation networks destroyed, agricultural systems disrupted, and industrial capacity obliterated. Without massive assistance, Europe faced decades of poverty, instability, and vulnerability to communist subversion. Secretary of State George Marshall announced the European Recovery Program, quickly dubbed the Marshall Plan, at Harvard University on June 5, 1947. The program offered American aid to all European nations willing to cooperate in reconstruction efforts. It was both humanitarian gesture and strategic necessity, designed to rebuild Western Europe as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The scale was breathtaking: $13.3 billion over 4 years, equivalent to over $150 billion today. The aid rebuilt factories, restored transportation networks, modernized agriculture, and provided the capital needed for economic recovery. But the Marshall Plan was more than just money. It required European cooperation, helped integrate former enemies, and laid the foundation for European unity. Britain and France, despite their victory, were exhausted. The war had bankrupted both empires and shattered their ability to maintain global commitments. The United States reluctantly assumed the mantle of Western leadership, accepting responsibilities that had once belonged to European powers. Germany's reconstruction posed particular challenges. The nation that had started the war needed to be rebuilt, but not rearmed, democratized, but not radicalized. The division of Germany complicated every decision, as Western reconstruction efforts had to balance German recovery with Allied security concerns and Soviet reactions. Japan faced similar challenges in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation government drafted a new constitution, dismantled the old political system, and introduced democratic reforms. The transformation was remarkable. The militaristic empire that had conquered much of Asia became a pacifist democracy committed to peaceful development. World War II had accelerated decolonization movements that would reshape the global map. The war's rhetoric of freedom and self-determination, combined with the weakening of European powers, created irresistible momentum for independence movements across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. India's partition in 1947 created two new nations, India and Pakistan, but at a terrible cost. Communal violence killed over 1 million people and displaced 14 million more. The partition demonstrated both the possibilities and perils of decolonization, setting patterns that would be repeated across the developing world. The creation of Israel in 1948 fulfilled a promise made to the Jewish people in the aftermath of the Holocaust. The new state provided a homeland for Holocaust survivors and Jewish refugees from Arab countries. But its establishment displaced Palestinian Arabs and created conflicts that continue today. The Middle East became a Cold War battleground as the superpowers competed for influence in this strategically vital region. Indonesia, Vietnam, Algeria, and dozens of other territories fought for independence, often with support from the Soviet Union or China. The colonial empires that had dominated the world for centuries crumbled within 2 decades of the war's end. By 1960, the United Nations had grown from 51 founding members to over 100 as former colonies gained independence. The process was rarely peaceful. The French fought bitter wars in Indochina and Algeria. The Dutch battled Indonesian nationalists. The British faced insurgencies from Kenya to Malaya. Portugal and Belgium held on longest, but even they eventually surrendered their African colonies in the 1970s. Decolonization created opportunities, but also instabilities. New nations often lacked the institutions, experience, and resources needed for effective governance. Arbitrary colonial boundaries frequently grouped incompatible ethnic and religious communities, setting the stage for future conflicts. The Cold War superpowers competed for influence in these newly independent states, often supporting dictators who promised alignment, rather than democrats who insisted on neutrality. The economic reconstruction of Europe succeeded beyond all expectations. By the 1950s, Western European living standards exceeded pre-war levels. The European Coal and Steel Community, founded in 1951, began the process of European integration that would eventually create the European Union. Former enemies became partners, then allies, then participants in an unprecedented experiment in voluntary political and economic union. Memory and meaning. How we remember WWII. No war in human history has been more thoroughly documented, studied, or remembered than World War II. The conflict that ended in 1945 continues to shape how we understand heroism, evil, sacrifice, and the responsibilities of democratic citizenship. But memory is never neutral. How we remember the war reflects who we are and who we aspire to become. The immediate post-war period saw the creation of memorials and monuments across the globe. The Soviet Union built massive memorials to the Great Patriotic War, emphasizing the heroism of the Red Army and the suffering of the Soviet people. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Moscow became a pilgrimage site where newlyweds left flowers and veterans gathered each May 9th to commemorate Victory Day. In Western Europe and America, memorials emphasized different themes: the defense of democracy, the liberation of the oppressed, and the alliance that saved civilization. The American Battle Monuments Commission erected cemeteries and memorials across Europe, their rows of white crosses serving as stark reminders of sacrifice. The Netherlands American Cemetery, Normandy American Cemetery, and dozens of others became places of pilgrimage for families and tourists alike. But Holocaust remembrance posed unique challenges. How could humanity memorialize genocide without trivializing other suffering? How could the systematic murder of 6 million Jews be preserved in memory without creating hierarchy among victims? The solutions varied by country and culture, but all grappled with the fundamental question: how do you remember the unthinkable? Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, established in 1953, became the world's primary Holocaust memorial and research center. Its mission, to remember the victims, honor the survivors, and educate future generations, set the standard for Holocaust education worldwide. the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, opened in Washington, D.C. in 1993, brought Holocaust remembrance to America's national consciousness. The Nuremberg trials had established extensive documentation of Nazi crimes, but it took decades for this evidence to be fully integrated into historical understanding. The 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, televised globally, brought Holocaust testimony into living rooms worldwide and sparked new scholarly interest in perpetrator psychology and victim experiences. Popular culture played a crucial role in shaping World War II memory. Hollywood films, from The Best Years of Our Lives to Saving Private Ryan, created powerful images of American heroism and sacrifice. British films celebrated the Blitz spirit and victory against odds. Soviet cinema emphasized the Eastern Front's central importance and communist heroism. But popular memory was often selective and sometimes misleading. The good war narrative, popular in America, emphasized clear moral distinctions between good and evil, while downplaying controversial aspects like internment of Japanese Americans, segregation in the military, and the decision to use atomic weapons. The heroic narrative served important purposes, but sometimes obscured the war's moral complexities. Different nations developed different memory traditions. Germany underwent a painful process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, that included acknowledgement of war crimes, reparations to victims, and education about Nazi atrocities. Japan's memory of the war remained more contested, with ongoing debates about responsibility for wartime actions and the proper way to remember atomic bombing victims. The Cold War influenced memory in complex ways. West Germany was quickly rehabilitated as an ally against communism, while emphasis on Nazi crimes sometimes served to delegitimize East German socialism. Soviet memory emphasized victory over fascism, while downplaying Stalin's own crimes. American memory celebrated the greatest generation, while the Vietnam War raised uncomfortable questions about American power and responsibility. Holocaust denial emerged as a fringe movement that gained attention by questioning established historical facts. Deniers exploited genuine historical debates to spread anti-Semitic propaganda disguised as scholarly inquiry. The response, laws criminalizing denial in many countries, enhanced documentation efforts, and survivor testimony projects, reflected determination that Holocaust memory would not be corrupted or lost. The end of the Cold War in 1989 to 91 opened new possibilities for World War II memory. Eastern European countries could finally tell their own stories of occupation, resistance, and liberation. The opening of Soviet archives revealed new information about wartime decision-making and casualties. But it also created new controversies as different national narratives competed for recognition and legitimacy. Recent decades have seen efforts to create more inclusive and accurate historical memory. The experiences of women, minorities, colonial subjects, and civilian populations have received greater attention. Military history has been supplemented by social history, cultural analysis, and trauma studies. Museums have become more sophisticated in their presentations, using interactive technology and personal testimony to make history accessible to new generations. But World War II memory faces new challenges in the 21st century. The last veterans and survivors are passing away, transforming lived memory into historical memory. Rising authoritarianism globally has led to new attempts to manipulate historical narratives for political purposes. Digital technology enables both better preservation of testimony and more sophisticated forms of historical falsification. Perhaps most concerning, some societies show signs of World War II fatigue, a sense that the conflict is too distant to remain relevant. This attitude ignores the continuing importance of the war's lessons about the fragility of democracy, the dangers of unchecked power, and the human capacity for both evil and heroism. Thank you for joining me throughout this 6-part series exploring humanity's greatest conflict and its enduring legacy. the war that began with a German invasion of Poland became a global struggle that reshaped human civilization. Its lessons about the fragility of peace, the importance of international cooperation, and the eternal vigilance required to preserve freedom remain as relevant today as they were in 1945. Please like, subscribe, and share this series with others who seek to understand how the past continues to shape our present and future. Most importantly, remember that we are all inheritors of both the tragedies and triumphs of World War II. How we choose to honor that inheritance will determine what kind of world we leave to future generations. The question now is, what will we do with the freedom they won for us?